You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Pete Boettke of George Mason University. Pete, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks very much. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So Pete has recently authored a book on F.A. Hayek for the Great Thinkers in Economics series, which will be our topic for today. Pete, tell me a bit about this book. It's not a biography of Hayek. But it's a discussion of his work and his ideas. First, how did this book come around, and what's the general premise of the book?
Well, first, how it came around is that the editor of the series with Macmillan asked me if I would be willing to write a book on Hayek. And so I was, it was a great opportunity. I decided to take it. And then once you take an opportunity like that, you kind of look around. So I sampled all the other books in the collection and, of the series, and then compared where I was in relationship to other books about Hayek, say, for example, Bruce Caldwell's work or Lanny Ebenstein's work about Hayek, which is a more popular treatment, or Don Boudreau's, book on Hayek, which is distilled basic principles that Fraser put out. And so I was thinking, okay, so what is it that I want to try to communicate with this book? And what I wanted to do and find my own market niche was to try to talk to young economists like yourself about the evolutionary potential of Hayek's ideas and to show the continuing learning that Hayek engaged in throughout his career and what is to be distilled from those ideas, which still has important resonance for research today in economics or the social sciences and humanities. And that was the kind of idea that I had in building, developing the book. There is a kind of, obviously, Hayek, the man, is in the book. Hayek, his career is in the book, and those things get talked about. There is an arc to Hayek's career, which fits a classic Jungian archetype, which is a meteoric rise, a crashing defeat, and then a resurrection. And those kind of stories always sort of resonate with readers. And so there is something about Hayek's career, but that's, the main emphasis that I wanted to push was, what is it about Hayek's ideas which still speak to social scientists and philosophers today, or should speak to them, and then try to make a persuasive case that Hayek's research program is alive and should be going forward.
Right. Yeah. Your book, by its nature, sort of rejects the what we might call the Whig theory of intellectual history, where all you need to read is articles from the top 10 journals in economics and only from the past 10 years, because of course they include all the insights from previous thinkers.
Right.
And of course that's a very naive view, and but it's one that is pervasive or implicit enough to have made the history of economic thought less and less of a part of an economics education.
A lot of people believe the history of the more mature a science is, the less it pays attention to its history. And in a discipline like economics, I think that is a big mistake because there are disputes and debates that go all the way back to Adam Smith, all the way coming forward today, which still speak to us. So I don't deny that there's progress in thought, that we understand certain issues better today than what Adam Smith understood in his time. That's not my position either. But I do think that we've actually lost some insights or wisdoms that older thinkers had. A classic example of this is things like David Hume argued, in the Treatise of Human Nature, that the foundation of social cooperation is property, contract, and consent. And so from the beginning of the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers about economics, people understood the importance of property rights, how property rights structure incentives that agents face. So how come in 1950s did we have to have a resurrection of property rights economics by Armin Alchian and Harold Themsetz and others? Or if you think about, interest group politics, one of the greatest satires in the history of economics was penned by Frederick Bastiat. The candlestick makers petitioned the government because of the unfair competition from the sun. People across the ideological spectrum could read that satire, understand what its importance was, that we should pay attention to, businesses lobbying government for protection against the forces of competition. So they are protecting themselves from competition rather than protecting competition. And yet somehow in the 1960s, we need to rediscover the concept of rent seeking and interest group politics and all these things. And so economic progress to me and ideas moves more or less like a corkscrew in which, we kind of have the circles in which we make progress, but there's times when we lose the progress that we're making to only have to recapture it again. And it's that sort of point which highlights the idea that we need to see the evolutionary potential of ideas no matter where they come from. And they could come from John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s about the dark forces of time and ignorance, or they could come from Ludwig von Mises in 1920 when he's telling us that economic calculation allows us to, in fact, negotiate those dark forces of time and ignorance and use those for the way we think about the world today and the imagined futures that we think of when we think about material progress, the entrepreneurial discovery process, and all of that. And so there's progress and there's retrogression. And what we need to do is work on this fine, knife edge in science where we continually make progress. And some of that progress is by rediscovering the past. Others of it is by breaking out into new areas. And so the book tries to negotiate that kind of evolutionary potential path with
Yeah.
regard to Hayek's ideas.
Yeah, it's interesting the reoccurrence of ideas, sometimes 100 years apart or more. It seems like, if I want to do my sort of short version of economic intellectual history, it seems like economists were working within one paradigm from Adam Smith to Hayek, or maybe several paradigms, but
Mm-hmm.
there's a distinction between pre-World War II economics and then the technical mathematical sort of science that comes out of the post-World War II world. And a lot of these rediscoveries are not only people rediscovering these concepts, but also making them mathematical and technical and restating them in a more modern language that has certain
Yeah.
advantages.
Yeah, look, the greatest ambiguities in science result from using the same words to mean different things and different words to mean the same thing. And mathematics promised to get rid of that. But mathematics introduced a whole host of other ambiguities, which people are, learn to deal with. But they didn't know that in the first run. I mean, there was a lot of reasons why people wanted to get out from underneath of the, hamster wheel of economic debate, going back over and over and over the same issues. But yet at the same time, if you actually look at the history of economics, we do resurrect a lot of the old debates, come back again. I mean, think about today and even consider like a modern work like the Glenn Weil and Eric Posner book on radical markets. What they're doing in a lot of ways is resurrecting ideas from Henry George, right? And sort of then trying to resurrect those ideas of Henry George and then apply them to the context of our times in order to sort of meet the objections that people have with the distribution of wealth and whatnot in society today. And part of what my argument is Hayek is that Hayek's ideas as part of that conversation raise a new challenge. So it's not just the incentive compatibilities that institutions structure, but also how is it that these different institutional environments impact social learning on the point of view of the individual within the system, but also of the system as a whole. That is, if I, as an entrepreneur, if coordination is the problem and entrepreneurship is the solution to, the coordination problem, it doesn't just require that one entrepreneur enter into a market and fill the gaps that exist. It's that if an existing entrepreneur doesn't adjust their behavior to the changing circumstances, another entrepreneur will step in to do it. That's system learning. And so if you think about like Alchin's evolution paper, right, what he's arguing in a lot of ways is that individual rationality is not as important as the system rationality that the weeding out and the weeding in of the market process generates. Well, Hayek was arguing that, but he was arguing, in addition to the structure of incentives that actors face, the kind of learning that's required that they engage in order to act on those incentives. And so that's where Hayek's knowledge problem all comes in. And my argument in the book is that Hayek tries to argue for what I call this epistemic institutionalism in not only in the market, but in terms of the law, in terms of politics and social mores in general. And so how do you see that research program playing out? And then how does it relate to, the puzzles today in terms of, technical issues having to do with like, how does our monetary system and macro policy interact? How does our fiscal policies interact with our monetary policies to impact the macro volatility, regulation in the microeconomy, planning debates, but also debates like development economics and the effort to orchestrate economic development. And then finally, what is the giant, liberal project that comes out of from the Scottish Enlightenment all the way up through to Hayek? And how do we see that liberal project taking place today? And, that's sort of the end of the book. It leads you through all of that. So,
yeah, the epistemic institutionalism it's a great phrase and it's a great concept. The idea that, or just it's something that I don't want to say it's entirely missing from, modern mainstream economics. We've sort of built knowledge and related, institutional
yeah.
knowledge and things like that back into economics, but for a long time, and it seems that for mostly technical reasons, the perfect knowledge assumption dominated a lot of economics, mostly because it's just so hard to formalize, the idea of people being wrong or having the wrong knowledge or wrong ideas, and just
Yeah.
it's just hard to make assumptions about how people are going to be wrong. In fact, that might be very well unknowable, so you just kind of default to assuming that they're basically right.
Yeah. Tractability is an important component of science, as is parsimony. But if you end up by substituting tractability for grappling with the sort of subtleties of the problem, it depends on all of these tools that we use in science are a function of the questions that we're asking. And if we need to ask questions about endogenous institutional change, let's say the immediate period of the post-communist period, or the problem of development economics. What is the problem with why some nations are rich and other nations are poor? It's because nations lack a certain institutional environment. Now the question is, how do they get that institutional environment? Can you transplant that institutional environment, by just like calling up on a phone and saying, here, follow these 5 rules, right? But if the existing social epistemology is at odds with that, the acceptance of those rules, you're going to have a hell of a time trying to impose those rules on the society. And so that's where you get this play between underlying belief systems, or what, Doug North referred to as mental models, and the kind of rules that are in there. And so once we start opening up economics to these kind of questions, a lot of the questions that Hayek put to the forefront, not in the background, but in the forefront of our analysis, become the questions that we have to work with. And if we have to work with those, we have to accept the tools that are, help us not evade those questions, but wrestle with those questions. And part of, the appeal of my book, which is more towards, hopefully towards people like in your situation, in your education, in your professional career, is that Hayek himself took many bites of an apple, and he becomes unsatisfied with certain answers that he gave. So that forced him to continue to learn. And so the fact that he wrote over 7 decades shows this evolution of his ideas. And so think about it, like even with his most radical ideas about denationalization of money, he comes up to that idea after a long history about writing about money, in which he tried to have, a variety of answers to the problem of how do you get monetary policy that will minimize macro volatility. And it's only very late in his life that he gets to the position that, well, we got to get rid of the monopoly supplier of the currency. And it's that kind of ideas. So it's sort of an invitation to inquiry for young research scholars, that to grapple with ideas that there's no easy solution for. So again, Hayek was a scientist in the same way that Richard Feynman is a scientist. And one of the defining characteristics of Feynman is that he always said that I always want to ask questions that don't have answers, rather than providing answers that can't be questioned. Right.
Mm.
And so the scientific attitude is this one of open inquiry, of constant evolution. And I want to see, people think about Hayek in that regard. It's not a fixed dogma. It's not a fixed doctrine. It's in fact instead an invitation to study political economy and the moral sciences as we need to study them for the 21st century. And so it's Hayekianism as opposed to Hayek that is really the subject of my book.
A lot of people draw a sort of hard distinction between Hayek, the economist, and Hayek, the political philosopher. And of course, his major works on various topics, come at different stages in his life. You talk in your preface about sort of dividing Hayek's life up into distinct stages where of course, the lines are always fuzzy, but there were different periods in his life where he focused on one thing and then he sort of pivoted to focusing on another. Do you want to give sort of an overview to the sort of path of Hayek's research?
Yeah, so the way I describe it in the preface is that you have, Hayek's beginning of his career is focused on this issue of the economics as a coordination problem. And so the way in which he inherits this research program from the older Austrian economists of his education was the problem of imputation. How is it that value of a consumer good, how does that then determine the price of the producer goods that go to, service the production of that good? And so Hayek was wrestling with that issue in his early work, because this is about the coordination of economic activities through time, right? In order to have a ham sandwich tomorrow, we need to have raised pigs yesterday, and all that goes into that. And we didn't get paid yet for the ham sandwich, but yet somehow we need to make this investment in these production goods to be able to do that. How does that all get coordinated? In many ways, this is what Keynes later on refers to as the dark forces of time and ignorance. It's all about investment paths, into the future. The future is this imagined future that I have no idea if whether or not that's going to come out. How do I steer the world between that? And so that's Hayek's original sort of fundamental question that leads to all of his development of his approach to capital theory, price theory, and then, of course, macroeconomics as he understands it, which is grounded in a price theoretic and a capital theoretic approach to economics. In the debates of the 1930s, he's pushed by, on the one level, the aggregation of Keynes, which in his mind masked the complexity of the capital coordination, the combinations of capital goods that make up the structure of production in the economy, and also the models that were developing about the way market prices operated mask the complexity of relative price adjustments guiding production. So his book, Prices and Production, is named precisely that. Prices are guides to production. Prices aren't past, summaries of costs, and prices aren't a sufficient statistic to tell us what an optimality condition is, but prices are guides to human decision making in this steering through these dark forces of time and ignorance to coordinate economic activity. And as that gets lost in economics, Hayek is searching to try to get that back. And that leads him to this next period of his career, which is the Abuse of Reason project. In the Abuse of Reason project, he sees both that this is a philosophical mistake that economists have made in the way that they study or approach social sciences. And that has two problems with it. One of them is that it drains the institutional background, which economists took so much for granted in the period from Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill to the early neoclassical period, which was, to what I said before, Hume's property, contract, and consent, and all that's embedded in that. Because if you think about that, what is the nature of property rights? How do we enforce property rights? This is going to affect what the legal system is like, what the political system is like. So if you think about property, contract, and consent, you're going to have stability of possession, the transference by consent, and the keeping of promises. And unless you have those three things, you're not going to be able to get social cooperation and the division of labor. And so that's all given as the institutional background against which economic activity has taken place. But since it was given, it became forgotten. And when it became forgotten, Hayek had to once again try to get people to pay attention to it. And his thought process is, why are they not paying attention to it? Well, they're not paying attention to it because they made a philosophical error. And that's why it's the Abuse of Reason project. And then from the founding of the Abuse of Reason project, you get into his next stage of his career, which is a restatement of the liberal principles of political economy and justice, which is a re-examination of those institutional ideas that evolved from the Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, and the development of Western liberalism. What are those institutions, and what do they mean for us today? And how do we provide a renewed defense of them in the wake of the fact that they've just been criticized, for the last 100 years? And that's when you start seeing him write the Constitution of Liberty and Law, Legislation, and Liberty and whatnot. And then the fourth part of his career, which I don't really develop much in the book, except in the end to talk about tensions that are involved in it. And that's what I call his forays into the philosophical anthropology of man, or the prehistory of man. So, he has this proposition where he says that man did not develop rules because of their reason, but man got reason because he followed rules. Well, where is it that we follow those rules? This is in our pre-human existence when we're, and then in our beginnings of our human interactions when we're in these small band communities and that. And so the real puzzle in Hayek's ideas is, how do you have the moral intuitions that we have evolved from our evolutionary past are often in conflict with the moral demands of the great society, or the cosmopolitan liberal order, which allows us to realize the great gains from social cooperation and division of labor. How do you interact those two things? And I talk about that only very a little bit, because my main focus in the book is on the first three periods of his career, and what of those periods are still points that we need in economics and in political economy and social philosophy today. Sorry for the long-winded answer there.
Oh, no, it's great. That gives a lot of good context on sort of evolution of these ideas. So the book goes through these in sort of a chronological order, I think, discussing the Hayek's ideas and how they relate to, ongoing project of economics and understanding markets and society in general. So tell me about the Hayek's work on market theory and the price system. How is that relevant, uh, to this day and to research, in the 21st century?
Yeah, so you were just talking about this before, and so if you look at for example, like Glenn Weil's paper that's coming out in the Journal of
Mhm.
Economic Literature on price theory, what he does in there, he basically examines all of the various implications of the fact that if a price is a sufficient statistic to ensure a competitive equilibrium, and then what are all the things that are involved in that. And so what Hayek is talking about is that these optimality conditions that we associate with the standard theorems in economics, they're byproducts of a process which we must study, right? And so if you even if you go to something like Dixit's more recent book on a very short introduction to price theory, he admits that, the stability properties of markets are things that no one has formally been able to prove, but yet we all take them as a sign of faith. That's included, by the way, in just supply and demand analysis, just basic supply and demand analysis. Vernon Smith has pointed this out, as well as that the experiment is like, double blind auctions that he engages in, and that they have in the lab. What that does is the lab simulation substitutes for a formal theory of convergence. And as you know, as someone who's been a student of these things, what Smith finds repeatedly over decades and thousands of experiments is that, two or three, four rounds, you converge to the equilibrium price, but you don't converge in the first round, right? It takes this process of buying low and selling high and weeding out and success coming in, and all of a sudden you end up by convergence to that equilibrium point. It's studying that process of convergence. And so, to give you an example of a contemporary debate, a few years ago I hosted a conference in which we had some Nobel Prize winners, living Nobel Prize winners, come back and talk about the implications of Hayek's research program for economics. And so the contributors to that included Ned Phelps, Vernon Smith, and Eric Maskin. And and then I published an old essay by Buchanan as part of that symposium. And there was a great line in there where, in the live debate, where Eric Maskin had just, given a talk, and he went in the mechanism design direction, as you might imagine. And so he talked about the informational efficiency of markets. And to use the sort of technical terms, right, he talked about the information space, like that's required, the threshold that the information in that space had to reach in order for markets to become efficient, right? And Vernon Smith talked after Maskin, and he was doing the double blind auction. He was explaining, the Hayek hypothesis, and he points to, the convergence, and he goes, Eric, he goes, there's the information space, right, which evolved endogenously, not exogenously given as a threshold. It evolved endogenously, and he goes, and they didn't know a damn thing. So the agents themselves didn't know a damn thing going into the market, but the market itself produced the informational threshold in order for them to be able to clear the market. That's not the standard way in which people envision this in the modeling exercise. And so Hayek is still grappling with questions about complexity and complex adaptive systems, which haven't yet been fully incorporated. I'm not saying that people aren't working on these issues. They are. Aldo Rusticini is doing all this stuff on, basically unawareness and, the kind of knowledge problem economics that one could see maybe in Roman Friedman, and that kind of work in which you basically have Bayesian updaters, but the Bayesian updaters don't update around one true model of the world, but instead update around their own theory consistent set of expectations. And so then how does that, it means that we have sluggish Bayesian updating, right? And we don't get the kind of rational expectations kind of equilibrium. That's what Friedman's AER articles about in his book on knowledge, imperfect knowledge economics. And so there are people working on these edges of things, and I want to see more people working on those edges. So that chapter that you're talking about is all about how Hayek should be seen as this forerunner of imperfect knowledge economics, and that imperfect knowledge economics hasn't yet generated enough of a swell of a research community to really address these things, and that within that there's a subset which would be more like the Kersnerian Austrian approach to these things, and I want to see that get be on more equal footing with some of these other approaches in competing for that space of being able to explain how it is that in a world where we don't have any price-taking behavior, we nevertheless can see markets converge to efficient allocation of resources, and how those optimality conditions emerge as byproducts of a filtering process that we call the market process.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to hear about just the ongoing research project that comes out of Hayek and that's continues to be fascinating and produce interesting insights. I think Hayek comes up a lot in popular discussions in terms of his political philosophy and his inspiration of political movements. Kind of indirectly through people like Murray Rothbard. But there's another strand to Hayek's thought where it inspires people like Vernon Smith, who, as you mentioned, Nobel laureate, and the field of experimental economics, which I'm working in, and which many people are working in, and kind of clawing out a respectable subfield, which is hard to do in economics because it's kind of a field that has some institutional inertia in terms of trying to do research in new areas that are not quickly recognized.
Yes, but but even in there, if you look at like not only Vernon Smith, but work by Charlie Plott, one of our former students from George Mason University who's done quite well for himself, Ryan Oprea, but also Bart Wilson, Eric Kimbrough. They're addressing issues having to do with, like, if you look at Plott and Ryan Oprea, sort of Walrasian dynamics, right? And trying to understand clearer and closer examinations of the Hayek hypothesis from what Vernon's talking about as they understand it. And they examine that in these kind of dynamic market adjustment models. If you look at Eric Kimbrough and Bart Wilson, they've talked about the evolution of property rights. How is it that private property rights come about? The endogenous evolution of institutions that elicit social cooperative behavior or sociability, right? And if you think about Hayek, one of the things that's a paradox is that, one, when the AEA had its 100th anniversary of the American Economic Review, they asked a set of select economists, Arrow, one of them, and others, to pick the top 20 articles in the first 100 years of the American Economic American Economic Review, and Hayek's Use of Knowledge in Society was one of the top 20 articles. And if you look at the appendix in my book, I do a citation study of Hayek's work, and if you compare him to the other Nobel Prize winners in economics, what you find is that if you look at the number of citations to other Nobel Prize winners within Nobel Prize winning lectures, right? So, Doug North's lecture, and then look at the citations, or Ken Arrow's lecture, and then look at the citations. Hayek is second in terms of citation count, only to Arrow. Arrow is the most, and then Hayek, and then Samuelson. So that's pretty significant, I think, if you think about that. But even if you look at total citations, so just do their total citation counts of his cohort, which in this book, what I did was I looked at the first 10 years of the Nobel Prize winners. So from 1969 to 1979, who won, during that period of time, and then compare their lifetime citations, with each other. Now, the top person in that is Herbert Simon. And, you might expect that because Simon wrote across so many disciplines, right? And so he garnered, so many citations or whatever. But, you have Arrow second, then Friedman, then Samuelson, then Hayek. That's pretty significant, right? That Hayek is that much up even in the citations. But part of what I'm arguing in the book is that Hayek has a weird kind of fate because, Milton Friedman or Paul Samuelson, they get their citations, and it's basically because you've captured the essence of what they're arguing. Very few people don't understand Friedman's monetary rule, right? Or that Friedman believed that, rules outperform discretion in monetary, policy. But what I'm trying to argue is that Hayek's main idea, which is about the use of knowledge in society, people don't quite fully understand what it is he was grappling with in asking us to think about that question. And so therefore, the fact that he's cited so much means that his idea gets discussed, but it doesn't get developed. And what I want to do is I want to get people to develop the idea rather than just cite it and go with it. But it's not that Hayek is ignored. It's that he's not fully appreciated for what he has to offer us.
Mhm.
That's at least the claim I'm trying to make in the book.
Interesting. So, yeah, it comes out of the paradigm that Hayek's writing in, right? Friedman rule can be expressed as as an equation or a set of equations, and and it's not that Hayek writes in a particularly unclear way. You don't win the Nobel Prize by just writing badly. It's that he's grappling with a really complex set of ideas that you know
Yeah.
that are just they're tough. They're tough to grasp. And
I think the way to understand them, so Garrett, I think the way to understand them is as follows. Frank Knight, in his book, The Economic Organization, which was a core book that people taught economics from way back when, okay? What Knight argued in the famous Chicago 301, course or whatever. So what Knight argued in that book, The Economic Organization, was that economic theory, these kind of optimality conditions and whatnot, they're kind of like the human skeleton, right? And so they form the human skeleton. If we don't have them, our arm couldn't actually function. I always think of the scene in the early Harry Potter movies where Harry breaks his arm and the goofy professor is going to try to help him. And he says, no, don't do it. And what happens is the professor, waves the wand. And what happens is Harry's bones disappear from his arm. Right. And so as a result, his flesh is just bouncing around. He can't control it. He can't do anything like that. It's just sort of bouncing around. And that's like economics when people don't have theory, right? It's kind of like just your arms just blobbing around. Your mind is just bobbing around. It doesn't have the ability to actually function. But think about what's wrong with economics when all you have is a skeleton, right? Then that actually misses out on all kinds of interesting things that could either make the skeletal structure work better, stronger muscles, things like that, or atrophying of muscles, which make the skeletons work less effective, right? And so what Hayek is trying to ask those questions is about this interaction effect between the life and blood of the institutional order within which we find ourselves in human societies. We are imperfect human beings living in imperfect worlds, bumping and bargaining with each other as we interact, right? And Hayek is trying to ask those kind of questions. As a result, he has to his thinking has to address these complexities that are associated with subjectivity, but subjectivity not just of values and costs, but subjectivity of expectations. They have to deal with time and the passage of time and the idea that time is irreversible. They have to deal with capital goods that are lumpy, not capital goods which are homogeneous, but instead heterogeneous capital goods that have multiple specific uses. And so therefore the coordination problem is more difficult. Or the evolution of institutions with regard to diverse communities. How is it that we have the cooperation of, as Adam Smith put it, we have scarce in our lifetime the chance to make but a few friends. How can we instead have cooperation when we have to rely on anonymous multitudes, right? What are the institutions that allow us to achieve that result? And in that sense, this is what Hayek's project is trying to get at. And therefore, the tools that he had to use have to pay attention to the flesh and blood, as well as being grounded in the skeleton. And I think, now I might be wrong, right? And, I invite people to, challenge back. I think that too often, we in developing theoretical economics focus exclusively on the skeleton. And whenever we introduce the flesh and blood, it's as a anomaly which causes the skeleton supposedly not to function, rather than it functioning. A classic example of this is, of course, behavioral economics, right? Whereas you introduce human frailties and all of a sudden, then, the system kind of goes haywire. Whereas in Hayek, that's not at all the case. We're always imperfect. We're fallible but capable human beings who rely on these various different aids to the human mind, prices, property prices, and profit and loss to guide us, to steer us, to lure us, to discipline us. And we need to study those kind of adjustment aspects to really get a full understanding of how markets operate, rather than just studying the skeleton. If that metaphor makes any sense, at least that's what I'm trying to sort of get us to think about.
Yeah, it does make sense. And it reminds me of a Hayek quote, which I'll paraphrase. He said that, in order to understand how an economy can go wrong, you first have to understand how it can go right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's sort of analogous to your skeleton in your metaphor, or just,
Yeah.
a system where the economy is going along smoothly, and there aren't it's not that there are no other things besides just, like, a vector of prices and quantities just smoothly being traded at some kind of general
Yeah.
equilibrium. But it's that the wrinkles and all the complexities and things are not debilitating. They have institutional or other ways that people have of dealing with them that make it so that the economy can function and be, and serve people's needs in a way that might not be theoretically perfectly optimal, because of course that's unattainable, but just satisfactory for the most part in most ways and in most areas.
Well, it's adaptively efficient, not allocationally efficient, right?
Mhm.
And so if you think about it in some technical sense, we're always operating inside of the production possibility frontier. But today's inefficiencies is tomorrow's profit opportunity for the entrepreneur who's able to act on it and move us closer. And so what happens in economics is, again, to introduce another metaphor, which I don't want to be just substituting metaphors for analysis, but if you think about what market forces do, the prices, property ownership, resource ownership, the prices, relative prices of goods, and the profit and loss accounting, those variables come out of the market. The underlying variables are the tastes and technologies and resource availability, right? So you have a pattern of resource ownership, you have relative prices, and you have profit and loss accounting. And somehow those have to map onto these underlying variables, which are the preferences or tastes of the people, the technological possibilities of that time and period, and then the resource availability that's there. And the way to think about that is like a dog chasing a rabbit, in your backyard. And what you'll find is that the dog is going to go towards where the rabbit is, but the rabbit then changes, and you'll note the dog has a new direction. But if the rabbit changes because tastes, technology, and resource availability are constantly changing, so economics becomes a science of tendencies and direction rather than a science of exact points. So if the rabbit stayed still and couldn't move, the dog would catch it. and then you would be in competitive equilibrium, right? And the pattern of resource ownership, the relative prices, and the profit and loss would exactly dovetail with the taste, technology, and resource availability. You would have, price equal to marginal cost. You'd produce at that level of output, which minimizes, average costs, and all gains from trade and all gains from innovation would be exploited, right? But since change is happening, the market moves in this new direction. And so what we want to study, I think, is that direction and dynamics of change. And that's what Hayek was trying to get us to think about. And the question is how is it that the market and market actors learn, like the dog, to go after where the new rabbit is, especially when we have multiple rabbits going, right? And so there's a variety of investment projects that could be going on in the market. And what you need to do is you need to sort out from the array of technologically feasible projects those which are economically viable. And you can only do that with certain tools of the market mechanism, mainly the ability to engage in monetary economic calculation. If we move outside of that context, we have to ask ourselves, what is the analog in the functional significance of the way we coordinate with one another of property prices and profit and loss? So if I move into politics, can I actually see, voting and agenda control and these kind of things do the same kind of function that property prices and profit and loss do? If I go into law, does stare decisis and, appeal decisions and that stuff, does that process work the same way? And if I go into societal norms as a whole, social movements, like religions or different kind of social practices or whatever, do we have the kind of feedback mechanism in social entrepreneurship that we have in our economic entrepreneurship? And so much of these kind of questions about learning and the dynamics of learning and how it is that we learn, that's what Hayek is trying to get us to think about. And those are the questions that we're still asking for the world that we live in today. And so that's why I think that there's so much evolutionary potential in his ideas. And by the way, I mean, it's a kind of since you study experiments and you study, technical economics, that it's kind of a caricature to use the old criticism of economics. It's not as true as it once was, that economics only works with smooth and continuous functions that are twice differentiable and desires single exit theories, right? So it would be a mistake if I harped on the criticisms that Hayek raised in the 1930s. Mm-hmm. Which was true. This is what was going on in the 1930s, right? Is the tractability was judged against the idea that we had to have smooth and continuous and twice differentiable, functions, and we'd be able to have single exit theories. Well, with the development of game theory and other techniques, we end up by having multiple equilibria, which, economists didn't have for many years in their toolkit. In fact, it was viewed as a problem, right? If we had multiple equilibria. Now we have multiple equilibria. We have various different ways in which we could deal with functions that are not so smooth and continuous and whatnot. And yet, are we still getting at the kind of questions? And so to the modern economist, the young modern economist like yourself, the question isn't how does Hayek react against general competitive equilibrium, the Arohan-Debreu world, right? It's that plus where does Hayek sit in this kind of modern, world of theory, and how do you position a proper institutional economics in the current context of a world dominated by, Mascalel, Winston, and Green, right? And those kind of approaches to economics, how do those fit in? And that's where, I think the young people, hopefully, that read the book can see this ability to adjudicate between the debates that Hayek was engaged in his life, which of course are limited to the people he was debating with, to how they could maybe take the ideas and creatively combine that with the worlds that they're debating today and to go forward. And so does agent-based computational models, does that lead us in a direction that maybe can address some of these questions? Is economic history, the right empirical sort of way that we go about doing that, in terms of testing out Hayek's ideas and about institutions? Could there even be a more radical departure where we merge things like the thin models of economics with the thick empirical research of anthropology and do kind of a modern rational choice, but anthropology as a kind of way to study evolutionary institutions and whatnot. And so to me, I think that the promise is the fact that there's all this open-endedness to Hayek's program once we recognize that we're dealing with a radical, like in some sense, indeterminacy, but yet bounded indeterminacy, if that makes any sense. Like, so we don't have single exits, but we also don't have an infinite outcome. We actually have a bounded set, and we have to understand where that comes from. And to me, this is a byproduct of recognizing something Charlie Plott calls the fundamental equation of politics, which is that the variation that we see in outcomes is a function of the variation we see in institutions. And so how is it that we can better study institutional variation? That's what should drive all of our research programs.
Yeah, yeah. Hayek, a lot of these insights from Hayek come out of his debates with, specific ideas and people in, in his time. So, you mentioned the economists of the 1930s, and yeah, economics has come a long way since then. And for you reference Maskell, Winston, and Green, which for any listeners who haven't gone to grad school in economics, it's just this enormous textbook full of the sort of modern standard of theoretical economics. Everything from supply and demand to advanced game theory and mechanism design. And so, yeah. And I mean, you also have two chapters about Hayek and his debates with the market socialists and, other such socialists, which, they have some historical interest. There are still socialists around today. It's maybe not the same.
Yeah.
That debate is not the same after the Cold War as it was, in the early days of the shortly after, within a decade of the Russian Revolution, and people experimenting with different ways to organize the economic system that tried to radically depart from capitalism. Let's talk a bit about how Hayek's thought comes out of that debate, and how it sort of frames his study of capitalism and markets. This fact that people were trying to radically redesign these systems.
Well, that's a great question. I think actually the debate, even in its most raw form, is still more relevant today than people might imagine. I'm actually in the process of preparing a large essay that I hope will go in the Journal of Economic Literature. Obviously, it has to go through the whole process, but that's the desire for it, and that's where it's going to go. And what I'm trying to do in that essay, I'm working on it with a very good close colleague of mine, who I'm also working on a bunch of history of price theory projects with, Rosalina Candela. And what we're trying to show in there is how that debate, starting with Mises's article in 1920, spawned so many different developments of modern economics, because people thought they were going to try to challenge and answer Mises's challenge about how can you engage in rational economic order in the absence of a private property in the means of production. And so that includes mechanism design theory, but it also includes things having to do in public finance. What Charles Thibault was really up to as an answer to a question that Musgrave gave him, which was about demand revelation in a world where you don't have price mechanism to rely on demand revelation. Leonhard Hurwitz actually went and studied with Mises in Switzerland, and then studied with Hayek in London in order to grapple with the idea, and led to his issues with mechanism design theory. And as you know, mechanism design theory is the foundation of everything from auction theory to, matching markets in, Al Roth or whatever. And so the evolution of Mises's insight which Hayek develops his own way in the 1930s, is extremely fruitful. And I'm trying to document all of that. In this book that you're just talking about here, not that other stuff, in this book, I'm focusing on how Hayek, in trying to come to grips with the thrust of Mises's argument and to translate that to a new audience away from the German context. Remember, Hayek is engaged in a debate in the English language about the socialist calculation stuff before Mises's essay is actually even published in English. So Mises's essay is published in English in 1935 for the first time. Robbins, Hayek's colleague, going all the way back into the early 1920s, mid 1920s, is already interested in translating Mises's socialism into English because that's what attracts him to these ideas as well. And so Hayek and Robbins are a formidable team, and they're trying to explain the institutional background for which the price mechanism operates to be able to achieve advanced economic coordination. And what the market socialists in Britain were arguing was that you could have a price system, but not without those institutions of the liberal order. You could have socialist institutions, but graft on top of that a price system so that you could have allocation, production efficiency and exchange efficiency. And so it's this model of market socialism that's developed by Lange and Lerner that becomes the foil against which Hayek and Robbins, and then eventually Mises, respond to in trying to articulate their theory of the market, which puts the institutions of private property to the forefront of the analysis again. And that had been pushed to the background. And also the problems of public administration. So, even Milton Friedman, in his review of Lerner's book, The Economics of Control, points out to Lerner that there's nothing logically wrong with his formulations of the optimality conditions. They just mimic what the standard economic arguments are. But the problem is that he never addresses the questions of the administrative cost associated with this system. Well, that leads to public choice, right? And the examination of the administrative costs of the cost of the public administration of economic activity. And so this argument has all these fruitful directions in which it goes in. And what I try to do in the first chapter, building right on the heels of the Hayek's articulation of the price system, is to then show how Hayek's development of his theory of the entrepreneurial market process, and what your listeners and know of as Hayek arguing that competition is a discovery procedure, Hayek's alternative to the perfect competition model, and the meaning of competition, where competition is meant to be as a rivalrous process, not as an end state in which all of the benefits of exchange have been exhausted. And it's articulating that idea, which he then brings to bear against the market socialists in, say, his essay, The Competitive Solution, in which he argues that you have to remember is that you can't treat costs as fixed and given. The costs that economic decision makers face in the market must be discovered anew every day. So, this is my rabbit and my, market moving. And so it's all about the nature of the price system. And if we assume static conditions, Hayek argues, then, if the rabbit is held firm and doesn't allow to move, right? Well, then, the market will dovetail, and then we wouldn't have the economic calculation problem, because the economic calculation problem would have already been solved by the equilibrium result. But it's precisely because change and growth and innovation introduces change and constant, ceaseless maneuvering and thinking that you need to talk about what is the mechanism by which the market operates. And if you get rid of the institutions of the market, can we expect this process to give us the same outcome that we would expect with property prices and profit and loss? And Hayek's answer is in the negative. Shadow prices don't do the same thing as monetary prices, that, administered dictates don't do the same thing as profit and loss, accounting, that even, output targets. And so I go through and I explain the theory argument, and then I highlight the road to serfdom, which is, in the way I treat it in here, it's not a political track. It's exploring the broader political economy implications of the argument. So the market socialists in the first chapter, they also were liberal in their politics. They believed in British liberalism, but they thought that they needed to be socialists in the economics in order to avoid the problems of business cycles and monopolies, which they thought were threatening the liberal order. So that's why the market socialists, that's why they hold the position that they do, is that they're going to be liberals in their politics, meaning, that they respect individual rights, they respect the rule of law, they expect, British liberalism, but they're socialists in their economics because socialism will eradicate business cycles and will not allow for the monopoly power that leads to the inequality of resource ownership and whatnot. And so what Hayek is trying to argue against is that when you try to implement socialism, by necessity, you erode those liberal institutions that you care so much about. So as a result, you end up in this tragic unintended consequence story, which is that, so it's not a slippery slope, it's a tragic warning of the unintended consequence that control over our economic means control over all of our means, which affects our liberty and all of the rest. And so that's what the road to serfdom sort of develops, that kind of thesis. And so I kind of lay out those two chapters. And then from those, I then develop in the next chapter, okay, so then what does an institutional economics, what I call a genuine institutional economics, look like? What would a genuine institutional economics look like? And in there, that's where I talk about this fuller notion of thinking about epistemic institutionalism and how we think about that with respect, and how then Hayek developed that argument in his subsequent career, where, as you mentioned before, he's writing things like the Constitution of Liberty and Law, Legislation, and Liberty.
Yeah, we're running low on time as much as I'd love to talk about Hayek even more. Do you want to give, well, first tell the listeners where they're going to be able to buy your book, and give the elevator pitch for why they should buy it in addition to having listened to this conversation.
Well, I think that, first of all, the best way for people to get it, it's a book with a academic publisher, and so its price tag is hefty compared to like your elevator, your airport book. But there is options, and so if you go online and you look up Great Thinkers in Economics series with Palgrave Macmillan, there is an option on that that's called My Copy, which is an individual copy of the book, which you can get for in the 20s, in the $20 things. But that's if your university library subscribes to the Palgrave Macmillan stuff, which most universities do. And so there is a way to get the book in a relatively inexpensive form, but the standard library binding of it is going to be like a typical academic book, and is going to be expensive, and probably too expensive for many of your listeners, but not all of them. In terms of the elevator pitch, what I try to do in the book is, as I said before, is I try to explain the evolution of Hayek's ideas in the context of the arc of his century that he lived, and to see where those ideas could go for you today. So it's not backward looking. It's backward looking to be able to give us a clearer picture of where we may go in the future. And I end the book, the last two chapters before the final concluding chapter are about the restructuring of the liberal project. And in particular, the chapter on restructuring, the Reconstruction of the Liberal Project, tries to take on what I consider the challenges of our day, which relate to the rise of populism, and in particular, right-wing and left-wing authoritarian populism and the difficulties of that, and trying to show how the liberal cosmopolitan vision gives us an alternative, attractive alternative to offer to future generations that sees the possibility of us saying yes to the great benefits of social cooperation among socially distant and diverse individuals. And so it makes an argument for political contestation and radical sort of decentralization, but also for the free mobility of people and resources throughout the world, and the ability of individuals to realize the benefits of productive specialization and peaceful social cooperation. And so hopefully that aspect of Hayek's ideas I get to communicate clearly and in a way that resonates with people today, to think about, as Hayek says, to think about the possibilities of what the future holds rather than the concerns about the future.
My guest today has been Pete Boettke. Pete, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.